So I finally finished playing through the new Pokemon game, and I feel compelled to write up this review, mostly because I spent the better part of the playthrough taking the piss out of the game, but also because despite the piss taking, I did actually enjoy the game. It's the first time Game Freak really tried to do something new with their property, and while the game stumbles at many of the hurdles, it does succeed where it's most important, being a good Pokemon game. Though the question remains, is it better than Pokemon Platinum, the shining gem of a Pokemon game that has gotten the most right out of any Pokemon game? Let's find out. The first thing I want to address, if for no other reason than because everyone already knows about this, even the people who didn't play the game, is its graphics. Yes, the game looks fine as long as you're looking at it within arm's reach of the character, but anything more than a few in-game meters away looks like a 1970s Atari game, fully pixelated for your convenience. Even up close, some of the models still look like some of their frames were left out. And as bad as all of this looks though, it by itself is not enough to ruin the game. It just makes you wonder where the better part of the budget went, because it clearly didn't go towards the soundtrack either, which is another thing I want to mention briefly. The sound quality is perfectly fine, but the mixes are dull and uninspired, so forgettable that I can't even recall one. Compare the gym theme from this game with the one from Sword and Shield. There's no contest as to which one is better, and there's not even an argument to be made that the choice of the musical compositions in the current game are strictly aesthetical. Sure, you could say that the Galar region has a stronger emphasis on the Pokemon League Challenge, which is why they have massive stadiums and huge crowds to turn out and watch the fights, and so the region's got an intense, upbeat, and pumping score, while the Paldean region is far less enthusiastic about Pokemon battles, and so they have ornate pitches, where people come to watch if they choose or if they're otherwise passing by, and as a result, the musical scores aren't as intense, but that's no excuse for them to not be upbeat, pumping, and otherwise keeping the player engaged in the game itself. But enough about that. These complaints can only taint a small part of the game's final judgment. Let's talk about some of the real meat of the game, starting with the map. After Pokemon Sword and Shield brought forth the wild area, a bold new direction for the franchise was set, and now here we stand, looking out over a vast, open Pokemon world, with only one thing to say. Holy fucking shit, this world is tiny. Honestly, I can't figure out why the decision was made to make the map this small, but I suspect it has something to do with an entity I'll touch on later. For now, all that matters is that the game world is small, and I suspect Game Freak knows this because they use a lot of their same tricks from previous Pokemon games to try and conceal how small the map really is. They try to have you jump around the map by placing objectives in random locations to encourage you to zigzag around the map, popping back and forth from areas you previously came through before going on to new ones. They even hid certain parts of the map behind traversal features, requiring you to go back to previously visited areas with the new traversal powers. While all these tricks are good and a great way to hide how small the map really is, and it's good to encourage checking out previously explored areas, the biggest problem is the leveling curve. Having a leveling curve in this game adds a pseudo-linearity to the experience. It really cuts into the flow of the game, as you suddenly find yourself completely outmatched and outleveled, wondering where you're actually supposed to go next. The game does try to add subtle little hints, which in its own right is commendable, since subtlety is one of my preferred methods when it comes to storytelling. But in a game like this, subtlety kind of kills it because it doesn't necessarily give you the information you need. It leaves you vaguely wandering about in what you can only hope is the correct direction. It makes me wonder the same thing many people wondered, which is why they didn't just make the Pokemon in the wild, as well as the most important battles, specifically gym leaders, crews, and the Titan Pokemon, to have a scaling level based on how many objectives you've completed up until that point. This would allow the player to tackle the game in any particular order they wanted, without the fear of being underleveled, unprepared, or otherwise railroaded in an open-world game. And as long as we're talking about the map, we should also talk briefly about the ability to move around it, and some of the traversal methods Game Freak has added. While adding the bike Pokemon to the game was a completely unnecessary thing to do when the bike already existed in previous Pokemon games, its travel speed is abysmally slow. Even when you obtain the speed upgrade, it only further serves to show how slow you truly are moving, when the boost is what honestly should have been the game's base speed. The added high jump and cliff scaling along with the swimming abilities were clever ways to allow additional traversal methods based on previous HM moves such as Surf and Rock Climb. Okay, maybe not so much the high jump, but nevertheless. However, the glide ability feels very underwhelming when you can only glide for a very short distance at any given time at a very slow speed and ultimately come plummeting down after around 30 seconds of flight. These sort of features are what lead me to believe that Game Freak themselves knew the map was small, and as a result, they had to make sure that their traversal powers didn't further exemplify just how small the world really was. While the size of the map isn't truly a deal breaker, it is unfortunate after playing other games on the Switch, including but not limited to Zelda Breath of the Wild, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and even Legends Arceus, which all make this game feel shallow by comparison. And small seems to be the name of the game for Scarlet and Violet because even the Pokémon are tiny. Some of them are damn near invisible even, making it all too easy to run into one as you're casually passing through an area and getting caught into another pointless battle you're just going to end up running away from. Which brings me nicely to another topic I wanted to talk about. The game's tendency to just drag on for no other reason. There are text boxes that will last far longer than they need to before disappearing. Animations take forever to load. Hell, some animations can't even progress until certain other animations finish just to add an unnecessary amount of tedium to the game, when all of it could just be avoided altogether by allowing these animations to play out simultaneously. And sure, maybe your Pokemon can't attack until their animation resets, but I suspect that there is a way to get the Pokemon back into their base animation without jump cutting or otherwise tampering with the animation. But everything up until now can, depending on the individual, be forgiven to some extent or another. I personally don't find any of this to be forgivable, considering this is a big-name AAA company that's associated closely with Nintendo, so there shouldn't be any sort of minor flaws like these that can generally be forgiven in a smaller indie game. But what we really should be talking about here is the story. Pokemon games have never had much of a story until more recent games. However, even with the story being more prevalent in the current generations, they've never had strong stories. Generally, they make quick, easy, simple narratives that children can understand. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with this in my opinion, they are, after all, making games for children. However, this particular story definitely is the strongest of all the more recent games, and in honesty, I feel kind of bad. Not because the story is good or that it's better than others in the franchise, but because of the potential they miss out on by limiting themselves to these simplistic storylines. This could be a whole video in and of itself, but for the sake of expediting this review, I'll just say this. Children are far smarter than most people will give them credit for. They can understand deeper, more complicated narratives, maybe not necessarily to the level of The Great Gatsby or The Count of Monte Cristo, but they're still capable of picking up on subtle cues and deeper meanings. All this just means that while the story is strong for a Pokemon story, it's not particularly strong in terms of story writing as a whole. And I feel that Game Freak could do better if they just stopped treating grade school level kids like they're fresh out of the womb. Overall, this game did have an acceptable story, and I can't find anything too much to complain about except for some one-dimensional characters like Nimona, who had little personality beyond, I like to battle Pokémon. But many of the other characters, especially the gym leaders, were far more fleshed out than in previous entries. So good for Game Freak. I hope they continue this trend in future installments. But now, let's talk gameplay. For the most part, this game plays out much like any other game in the core series. Run around the overworld, get into turn-based battles, use the rock, paper, scissors formula that Pokemon is most well known for, collect 8 badges, fight the 5 best trainers in the region, and game content. Scarlet and Violet did add a few new twists to the gameplay. In addition to the usual 8 badges, you can, or should I say you have to, take on the 5 bases controlled by a team, insert Game Freak's word of the day here, and 5 Titan Pokemon. The former requires you to clear out a base using an augmented formula of the new auto-battling system, more on that later, a feature I do absolutely love, before fighting the boss in a classic battle topped off with what is basically a totem Pokemon from the Sun and Moon games. A great and fair challenge that I do appreciate, even if the auto-battling the minion part drags on for far longer than it should, and doesn't feel all that rewarding. The Titan Pokemon were an interesting addition. They again remind me of the totem Pokemon from Generation 7, but they were a nice shake-up to the usual droll. So, points for Game Freak. But like I said, I do want to talk more about the auto-battlings. I'll say right off the bat that the auto-battling mechanic is definitely one of the best features Pokemon's ever added to the game, especially in a game that runs as slowly as this one does. For those of you who don't know, the way this works is the game allows you to throw out one of your Pokemon to follow alongside your character. You can then command them to battle other nearby wild Pokemon, at which point the game will take into account the type matchup of the 2 Pokemon engaged, as well as level, in this quick little battle to determine a winner. The winning Pokemon can take anywhere from half their HP or less all the way down to 0 damage in battle, while if you lose the battle, you can be dropped all the way down to 1 HP. You can't die in this, thankfully, because your Pokemon will run back to you safe and intact. The only real complaint I have about it is this. Well, okay, honestly, there's 2 complaints, but first is the fact that you can only put 1 Pokemon out at a time. This feels kind of like the Pokemon feature that would be fun to throw out all of your Pokemon and just let them go absolutely ham on the map. Running from one little engagement to the next, gaining experience and coming back to you, a prideful smile on their face, and a fistful of items. The other thing I have to complain about is the XP. The XP you gain from auto-battling is only about 25 to maybe 35%, from what I can judge, of the normal XP you would acquire from beating these wild Pokemon. Both of these complaints are relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, and the auto-battling system does its job of expediting the grind process, so even these complaints are little more than nitpicks. I look forward to this feature being in future Pokemon games. Next, I want to touch on the creativity on display. Pokemon has always been a game that is a masterpiece of creativity, generally speaking. Obviously, here and there are a few duds when it comes to Pokemon creation, but generally they make up some pretty good designs. And well, most of the Pokemon added to this generation that were displayed on the overworld definitely fit the criteria for creativity. But the endgame Pokemon from the time traveling event left a bad taste in my mouth. The past Pokemon look exactly like their present day Pokemon, but with a few minor changes to help make them look distinct. Extra spike or two here, maybe a slightly different color palette there. And the future Pokemon are just worse. They're just taking the current day Pokemon and coating them in metal. This is really unfortunate. I think it not only displays a lack of creativity, but also a huge missed opportunity. These Pokemon could have been some of the most creative things Game Freak ever did, taking some of their modern day Pokemon counterparts and asking the question, what did these Pokemon look like way back when? Or what will they look like in the future? Instead, what we got were recolorings and a slight remodeling of older Pokemon, and just a bunch of animatronics that wouldn't look out of place in a Chuck E. Cheese. As a thought experiment, let's look at Donphan. How about for the past variant, it doesn't have a distinct trunk, instead just a longer aardvark-like nose, and its tail resembles that more of an elephant, hippo, or rhino's. It's far smaller than its modern counterpart, and its tread-like back is instead a full armored shell like that of a, I'm going to mispronounce this here, Dodicurious, or armadillo, if you prefer. This older Donphan's learning to roll would be what contributes to modern-day Donphan's tread-like pattern along its back, as well as the thicker trunk and tail to help it roll better, eventually turning a defensive ability into a more offensive one. There's a lot you could do with future Donphan, but for brevity, I'll just quickly go over one option I came up with. How about the Donphan species keeps growing bigger and taller? The result is it grows out of the need to roll. Its size now suffices to scare off most predators. So its trunk splits down the middle, leaving a nostril on each end that each act as an independent appendage, similar to an elephant's trunk. Its tail atrophies due to becoming vestigial, leaving it little trace that it ever had one. And this tread-like armor now serves as a sort of car seat, shall we say, where the adults place the young Phanpy during migrations, or to shield them from enemy attacks. See, this is just off the top of my head while writing this review. God forbid I take the time to really think about it. Overall, these future and past Pokemon were just a huge disappointment right at the end of the game that I'm willing to overlook for the most part because the rest of the Pokemon designs were definitely on par with the standard hit and miss, as mentioned before, and they definitely had a few standouts as well. There's a bunch of other nitpicky things I could mention about the game, such as the held items having the give command below the use command, but I think what merits a good long paragraph or two is the options menu. This is problematic not only in the Pokemon games, but something I've noticed across many different games that come out on consoles. The options menu is just severely lacking. In addition to certain features being removed, such as not being able to change the game mode from Switch to Set, I would say the biggest complaint I have is that they don't have the ability to rebind the buttons. And this just strikes me as one of the worst decisions any game creator can make. By not allowing players the freedom to rebind and map their key buttons the way they feel comfortable pressing them and activating the effects they want, you're limiting their ability to enjoy the game. Sure, it's not the worst offense to make, but every little thing like this causes the players to disengage from the game. It breaks immersion when I have to constantly try to remember that I'm holding a controller and which button I have to press to do certain effects. As an example, I spent the entirety of my gameplay pressing the plus button to try and open the map, and instead ended up either mounting or dismounting the bike Pokemon, whereas in previous Pokemon games, the shortcut for what I would normally have set the bike to would be the Y button on the old DS games. Instead, this button is now used to open the map. I don't want to get too much more into this particular topic because, once again, this is something that could be a video all on its own. I just wanted to point out that this is a niggling feature that I can't help as, say, tarnishes my opinion of the game, if only just a bit. But now let's get into one last topic before we conclude this review. That is the relationship between Game Freak and Nintendo. As I mentioned much earlier, I had an entity in mind that I wanted to touch on here, and that is Nintendo. I feel that a lot of the problems with this game actually come from Nintendo and not from Game Freak. The more I look over this game, the more I play it, and the more I write this review, the more I can't help but think, there's no way the developers wanted to release it like this. There's no way that they felt confident that this was a good product. The developers would know better. And the more I thought about it, it hit me. It's Nintendo. Nintendo set them a deadline and said it had to be done regardless of the condition. This is a huge problem. And it's not just this game or Nintendo games as a whole, but a publisher problem in general. Setting these crazy deadlines and asking developers to cram in as much as they can, it leaves a lot of games, not just this one, lacking in a lot of features. Bugs and glitches slip through the cracks, and the game itself just looks unfinished, unpolished, untested. Hell, one of the features in this game is if you fall off a cliff and get stuck in the geometry, the game will let you sit there for a while before teleporting you out. When in truth, this is the kind of thing that shouldn't happen. Playtesters and other developers should have been able to find these locations that you can clip through the map and block them off so that you can't fall. While I'm not knocking the ability to have that feature, it's definitely a good feature in case they missed any. A lot of the places I found myself stuck in were areas that really should have just been easily enough to wall off and probably should have been walled off during the development of the area itself. Again, it's hard to blame Game Freak for this because I'm convinced that this is Nintendo's fault. They told Game Freak, you had X amount of time, you will deliver this product, and in the end, Game Freak just gave them what they had. Nothing more Game Freak could do about it. The backlash Nintendo received from this product and the massive amounts of returns that they suffered, I hope is a wake-up call to them. I hope this lets Nintendo know that they can't just slap the Pokemon name on top of anything they want, call it a game, and make billions of dollars off it. I really do hope that to Nintendo, the next time, for Generation 10, they really let Game Freak put in the necessary amount of work to make the game great. But here we are at the end of the review, and of course the question must be asked again, is Scarlet and Violet better than Pokemon Platinum? And the answer is a resounding, I don't know. One thing I noticed as I was thinking about this game towards the end, and then contemplated again while I was writing this review, was the question I had when I played Breath of the Wild for the second time. Is this game truly a good game? Or am I just so blinded by the new features and the unique playstyle, and it just feels so different from all of its predecessors that I can't help but enjoy this breath of fresh air? As I look through this review, I can definitely see some praise throughout it, but I also see many, many instances of harsh critique. Critique that, when I compare it to other Pokemon games, I ask myself, would I allow this critique to override the positives, or am I allowing the positives of this game to override the critique? And truthfully, even right now, I'm not sure I can truly give an answer to that question. So while I'm not afraid to admit that Scarlet and Violet are definitely good Pokemon games, I don't know if I can bring myself to make any claim of certainty as to whether they're the best of the Pokemon franchise. So, for now, Pokemon Platinum for me still stands as the definitive best Pokemon game. At the very least, this game comes in maybe second, third place, or at the very least the top 5. That's all I have to say on this subject, so I'll see you guys next time. Oh, and the YouTube buzzwords, all that stuff, where we got like, comment, subscribe, something about a bell, description, algorithm, doobly-doo, etc.